Right now, as you're watching this, a war that most Americans think ended at the Russian border is quietly drawing in a new set of targets, and one of them is the country that sent drones to kill Israelis. Ukraine made a choice. It chose to supply Iran-designed Shahd drones, the same ones that rained down on Tel Aviv, to Israel's enemies. That's not speculation. That's the operational reality being tracked in intelligence circles from Washington to Tel Aviv to Tehran. And Tehran is paying attention. Here's what nobody is connecting for you. Iran doesn't just see a weapons pipeline. It sees a nation that dared to arm its enemy in the middle of a regional war. And in the calculus of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that is not a neutral act. That is a declaration. Iran has already demonstrated the will and the reach to strike far beyond its borders. It has proxy networks threading through Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. It has missiles that can hit things it isn't supposed to be able to hit. So the real question, isn't whether Iran is angry at Ukraine. The question is whether Iran believes it can impose a cost, and whether the rest of the world, already exhausted by two active war fronts, has the will to stop it. This is where geopolitics stops being an abstraction and starts being a countdown. Let me take you back to a moment that most Western newsrooms glossed over. It was sometime in the middle of the ongoing Gaza conflict when satellite imagery and battlefield analysts started noticing something deeply uncomfortable. Ukrainian-linked drone technology showing up in the hands of forces aligned against Iran's sworn enemy. Now, Ukraine didn't stand up at a podium and announce this. That's not how these things work. In the world of proxy warfare and quiet military partnerships, the transactions happen in the dark, and the consequences arrive in the light. And what's happening right now, if you're willing to look at it honestly, is that Ukraine walked into the middle of a war that was never supposed to be its war, and it brought gifts that one side will never forgive. You have to understand something about Iran's strategic culture before you can make sense of any of this. Iran does not process betrayal the way Western nations do. There is no strongly worded letter. There is no emergency UN resolution that Tehran is going to tremble over. Iran operates on a doctrine of patient retaliation, sometimes called strategic patience, where the response to a provocation might not come tomorrow or next month, but it will come. The Revolutionary Guard leadership has spent decades building a philosophy around the idea that every enemy action has a price tag attached to it, and that price gets collected on Iran's timeline, not yours. When Ukraine made the decision, and it was a decision, not an accident, to support operations that put drone capability in the hands of those fighting against Iranian allies and interests, it entered that ledger. It became part of Iran's accounting. Now some of you are thinking, wait, Ukraine is fighting for its survival against Russia. Why would it get involved in the Middle East at all? And that's the right question to ask, because the answer tells you everything about how desperate and how calculating Kyiv has become. Ukraine needs money. Ukraine needs weapons. Ukraine needs friends and places that can apply pressure on Russia. Israel, and by extension the broader American-Israeli security architecture, represents a source of funding, intelligence sharing, and diplomatic leverage that Kyiv cannot afford to ignore. So when Israel came looking for something Ukraine could provide, specifically the technical knowledge and certain drone components tied to captured or reverse-engineered Russian systems, Ukraine saw an opportunity, a transaction, a way to deepen a relationship with a powerful partner at a moment when Kyiv is watching its Western support show signs of fatigue. What Ukraine may not have fully calculated is that Iran was watching too, and Iran has a very long memory. The Shahd drone program is one of the most consequential military exports in modern history, and not enough people in America are talking about it seriously. These are not sophisticated weapons by the standard of American military hardware. They are cheap, slow, and relatively easy to shoot down one at a time. But they are also available in numbers that overwhelm air defense systems, and they have been deployed against Ukrainian cities with devastating effectiveness. The same design philosophy that made them useful over Kyiv made them useful over Israeli territory. So when Ukrainian officials and their intelligence partners began examining how to counterprogram these systems, how to understand their targeting logic, their frequency vulnerabilities, their operational signatures, that knowledge became a weapon in itself. And sharing that weapon with Israel meant directly degrading Iran's most important gift to the axis of resistance. That is not a small thing. That is not a diplomatic footnote. In Tehran's eyes, that is an act of war by a country that was already on thin ice. Here is where the global power structure comes into the picture and where it gets genuinely frightening. Russia and Iran are not just transactional partners anymore. What began as a commercial relationship centered on drone sales has evolved into something that looks increasingly like a strategic alliance. Russia gets Iranian drones and ballistic missiles. Iran gets Russian air defense technology, diplomatic cover at the UN Security Council, and a partner that is actively weakening the Western alliance that Iran considers its existential adversary. These two countries are now bound together by a shared interest in seeing American global influence contract. And Ukraine, whether it fully understood this or not, just pulled on a thread that connects both of them. When Ukraine acts against Iranian interests in the Middle East, Russia notices. When Russia and Iran compare notes, and they do compare notes, at every level from intelligence services to military command, Ukraine's behavior in the Israeli theater becomes part of the conversation about what kind of pressure Iran is justified in applying. That's the architecture of the threat, and it is real. Now let's talk about what an Iranian escalation against Ukraine would actually look like, because this is where people's imaginations either go too far or not far enough. It would not look like Iranian fighter jets over Kyiv. Iran does not have the conventional force projection to conduct a direct military strike on a country thousands of miles away. What Iran has is something arguably more dangerous, a global network of proxy actors, cyber capabilities that have been demonstrated against industrial infrastructure in multiple countries, and the ability to supply Russia with next-generation drone and missile technology specifically calibrated to punch through the air defense upgrades that the West has been sending Ukraine. In other words, Iran doesn't need to attack Ukraine directly. It can deepen Ukraine's nightmare by making Russia's arsenal more lethal, more precise, and more overwhelming. That is the Iranian way of war. Indirect, deniable, effective. And then there is the cyber dimension, which almost never gets the serious treatment it deserves in mainstream coverage. Iranian cyber units, particularly those linked to APT-33 and related threat actors, have been probing European and NATO-adjacent infrastructure for years. Ukraine's power grid, its logistics networks, its communication infrastructure, all of these represent target sets that Iranian cyber operators have both the motivation and demonstrated capability to attack. A coordinated cyber campaign against Ukrainian infrastructure, timed to coincide with a Russian offensive push, would not announce itself as Iranian. It would just look like the lights going out. It would look like supply chains failing. It would look like Ukrainian civilians suffering in ways that are hard to attribute and even harder to punish. That is precisely the kind of operation that Iran has invested in, and Ukraine's decision to enter the Israeli theater gives Tehran the political justification internally to authorize it. But zoom out even further, and what you're really seeing here is a realignment of the global moral order that should be keeping American policymakers up at night. The old framework, where the United States and its allies set the rules of international engagement and everyone else either played along or faced isolation, that framework is under more pressure than at any point since the Cold War ended. Russia, Iran, China, North Korea, these are not acting as rogue states anymore in the traditional sense. They are acting as the architects of an alternative system, one where sovereignty means the freedom to arm whoever you want, strike whoever threatens you, and build partnerships that explicitly exclude American influence. Ukraine got caught in the intersection of two separate theaters of that new world, the European theater and the Middle Eastern theater, and it may be discovering that those theaters are not as separate as they appeared. The Ukrainian government is not naive. President Zelensky and the people around him understand geopolitics with the kind of clarity that only comes from fighting for your country's survival with imperfect weapons and imperfect allies. So when Kyiv made the calculation to deepen ties with Israel and provide assistance that would ultimately work against Iranian capabilities, they knew there would be a cost. The question is whether they believed the benefit, stronger American support, Israeli intelligence cooperation, access to Israeli cyber and technology networks, was worth the risk of adding Iran to the list of countries that want to see Ukraine destroyed. And that is a list that was already long enough. What makes this moment genuinely unprecedented is the speed at which these alignments are shifting. 6 years ago, nobody was seriously discussing an Iranian-Russian military alliance. 3 years ago, nobody expected Ukraine to become a player in Middle Eastern weapons dynamics. 2 years ago, the idea that Iranian drones would define the character of a European land war seemed like science fiction. And yet here we are, in a world where all of those things are simultaneously true, and where the decisions made in Kyiv, Tehran, Moscow, and Tel Aviv are pulling on the same tangled web of consequences. The global order is not just changing, it is accelerating through its change, and most people are still using the old maps to navigate it. That is the story nobody is telling you straight. And it matters, because the next phase of this, whatever it looks like, is not going to announce itself with a declaration of war or press conference. It is going to announce itself in the dark, the way these things always do, in a power grid that goes down, in a drone swarm that is somehow more capable than last month's model, in a diplomatic back channel that suddenly goes cold, in a casualty figure that climbs higher than the previous week for reasons that analysts will explain only after the fact. Ukraine chose its partners. Iran is choosing its response. And somewhere in the space between those two decisions, the rest of the world is waiting to find out what the new rules actually are.